Hey, we have another setting up shop video we want to share with you, and this time I'm going to show you my lathe. This is my Spring-Pole Lathe. And it's called a Spring-Pole Lathe because we had this pole, this sapling, mounted up in the ceiling here so that we can pull down this with the treadle on the lathe. If you stay there, I'll show you the operation so you can see the whole thing in action. I have the treadle or the pedal down here. And when I step on this, there's a rope tied to the end, and it wraps around my workpiece down to the treadle. So when I step, it turns the piece, and it pulls this sapling down into tension, and it's still pinned over there. And so when I release off the treadle, the sapling is going to snap the whole thing back. So down and up, down and up. And so this turns the piece, and there are two fixed there's an axis of two fixed points to create this axis so that I can keep it nice and perfectly round. So this is a Spring-Pole Lathe. It's a very ancient technology. I think it's like 13th century. There was a drawing that I saw of those. And so it has a reciprocal motion. I'll show you how this works if you want to come around. I built this lathe for issue 2, but I wrote about it in issue 3, the actual construction of the lathe. And if you have read issue 3, you'll see there are some different things I have here that I didn't have at that time. Like all good shop appliances, they should evolve over time, and this certainly has. So if you didn't have issue 3, if you don't have a copy, we are republishing issue 3 in a hardbound book, which is issues 1 through 3, so we're calling it the first 3 issues. So this hardbound book is available for pre-orders. It's about to come out soon. And so in issue 3 of that book, I walk through the whole process of how I built this lathe. Now I don't have measured drawings for the lathe. I actually never had any myself because you can see what's going on here. It's 2 horizontals across, and you have an upright fixed this way. The height of the bed is really actually dependent on what work you're doing and how big of a diameter you want. So for me, it's right below my hip, but it really could go up or down. It just depends on what kind of work you want to do. But for me, I wanted that diameter to be able to turn something this small, or this big, I should say, but not necessarily anything bigger. Obviously, if you're turning something bigger than this, that's some crazy turning. So I don't need that. So this is a little bit below waist height, a few inches below that. And I have a fixed upright. So this goes all the way to the floor, and I put some braces to make it all nice and tight. This is made out of white oak, and it's basically timber framed. So these braces have drawbore pegs. It's all nice and solid. On both sides, I have one over here, but I don't need the upright to come up tall because I only need one point on this side. So this white oak is good because it's really heavy. Unfortunately, it is quite expensive. So if you just find a really heavy wood, that's important. My first lathe was made out of nominal pine or spruce lumber, 2x lumber, and it's fine if you screw it to the floor or something. If you really have some way to fasten it, you really want to make it rigid because weight helps a lot. This is not fastened to the floor, and it's just fine. It doesn't move around. The only other thing I will say that I have since changed since building for issue 3, since I made the lathe, is you'll see the horizontals here, the bed, these rails, they're actually notched. They have a little half lap so that they lock onto the upright. And so in that, what I did before is I had them basically cut flush here, but I ended up wanting to shorten it anyways. And so what I did is I made it like a notch, so it locks right into that. And that just made the whole thing that much more solid. I contemplated putting some sort of brace in here, but that would interfere with everything I'm trying to do, obviously, in this area. So I just skipped that. So these, I would say definitely you want to notch these rails into the uprights. So besides that, I mean, you just have a tool rest here. I just have a wing nut that I can loosen and slide this back and forth. And so this basic operation, the rope just comes down here. I first cut a little groove so the rope goes into that groove and it kind of stays there. And I just go up and down. So it's a reciprocal motion. So I'm cutting when it's turning toward me, I'm cutting. So and on the return, you don't have to pull it away. It just doesn't cut because it's returning back, right? It's just not engaging. So that's the basic idea of how this tool works. I would say it's very efficient. It's not as efficient as an electric lathe, obviously, but it's very efficient for, you know, if you're doing small batches of things or one-offs, making a tool handle or something. I really love using my Spring-Pole Lathe. So this is the only lathe I intend to have. I really like it a lot. What you'll also see with this is this whole other craziness over here. I have these two other centers and they're higher, and this is for turning bowls. I don't yet have a lot of experience turning bowls. I've only played around with it some. But you actually use different tools altogether for that. You have this mandrel right here, and it has these metal, well, they're nails that I drove in and then cut off and filed so they're nice and sharp. And you drive this into the block of wood and you put this in one side and the block of wood in the other. So you have it all this way locked together. So center point here and the center point in the block of the wood. And then what you can do is you use these big hook tools, big long handles and little tiny hooks, and you can get inside of the block of wood and, you know, use the treadle to cut down inside. Now you can see I need this rope here to wrap onto the mandrel. The rope wraps like this, around this way. So what I do, because my lathe isn't fixed to the floor, I just slide it over a couple feet so that this rope is coming down right here. So it's really easy to do that. If this was fastened to the floor, I would have to come up with a way to move the rope and the treadle over. But my pedal or treadle is fastened to my floor, so it's not sliding around. So it's easier just to pick up this white oak lathe 2 feet than to try to change over ropes and do all this fancy stuff. So you'll see there's a tool rest here for this, and this pivots. This just has a pin that pops in here. And these centers are higher for bowl turning, so you can get down inside of there. And if I need to get tighter, I'll just get right in there if I have to. And this works great for that, but like I said, I'm not a proficient bowl turner by any means. So this is just a new thing for me to play around with. But you can see I have a center here, and I have a center down low for two different kinds of turning. And in my research of a pre-industrial cabinet maker named Jonathan Fisher, his lathe, he had these are called poppets, and his poppets had centers at different heights on both sides, and he was doing all sorts of stuff. And so that really inspired me just to modify my existing poppet with this center for bowl turning right on top of it. So that's the basic overview of this. But if I take this off, I'll show you how you set this up. There is a screw here that you can loosen and tighten, and is basically just a screw with a point, and then there's a little bar here. But I typically don't spend a lot of time turning that. What I usually will do is use the wedge and just tap that out. So I'll drop this out. So this poppet just has a big tenon that comes down below, and there's a big wedge here. And I have a little tiny pin right here so that I can do that and it doesn't hit the floor. I used to have it hit my leg so I didn't lose it, and I thought, oh yeah, that's right. Somebody, I don't remember who, somebody just put a pin there, and it's such a simple thing, but you know, until you see it, you don't think of it. So what I do is I have the workpiece that I usually rive this work so it's nice straight grain. So I'll rive it on the stump, which you watched that video about the stump. I'll rive that and hew it into an approximate round-ish shape. If I really feel like I'm fighting it, I'll bring it to the shaving horse just to kind of even it out. But the way this works is I'll grab my workpiece in my left hand and I'll take the rope this way, oops, and wrap it around. I would say at least 2 times, depending on the size, but the smaller it is, the bigger, the more wraps you can get, and the more efficient your turning is going to be. And you can see how I was holding the back of this to keep it nice and tight. And I hit my wedge, and what I want to do is I'm going to push this back and forth to make sure it's tight, but I also want to know that it's going to turn freely. So what'll happen is when you just get started and you just make a little hole, where do I have that? I have a little auger that I just start a hole on either side of the workpiece. When you put that hole, those centers on, and you get started, the points haven't worn anything. There's just a little spot. So as you keep turning, it's going to start wearing that hole to match the center points. And if you're not careful, this will start getting loose, and all of a sudden you can see what's going to happen. All of a sudden, boing, and it's going to go flying out right into the camera or your friend. So you want to be mindful of that the first couple minutes of turning. Just keep checking to make sure that nothing's getting loose. And if it is, you can tighten the bar, or you can tap on the back to make sure it's tight. So before I start turning, I'm making sure everything's tight. Also, what'll happen is it'll wear, and it'll get wobbly, and then it'll flip out, and then your center point is all worn into an oval, and it's really hard to get it back straight. So this is the basic idea with this. I will just turn this way until I hear my smooth cut. So turning an irregular surface nice and smooth. And then I have all sorts of typical gouges for turning that people use. I have a little thumbnail gouge for cutting in. And at this point, I will say it's a little trickier, so I hear. It's a little trickier than an electric lathe in that there's the return, so you got to be careful about catching. But it's also a little trickier because it's a lot slower. The rotation's a lot slower. So that means these tools need to be razor sharp, just like any paring chisel. So you can't just put it on a grinder and put a super high speed and get a clean cut. That will not be clean. These have to be like carving gouges. So that's the only other consideration with it. I don't think of it as a downside, it's just a consideration. So you can do all the same things you can do with any other, but the last thing I'll point out is you can see I can just stop like that. Also, when you're learning, if you plunge too hard and it gets caught, you catch, it's just going to stop. The rope's going to just let it spin, you know? So you're not going to have any dangerous catches where things are flying and it's, kind of a hazard. So it's a safe way to learn, but it's also slow. And you can just stop and go, okay, that looks pretty good. And then keep going. And then you can check your progress and say, yeah, that looks nice and clean. I'm going to stop there. So I like the Spring-Pole Lathe. It's adaptable. If you're using white oak, it's not cheap. But otherwise, if you use something heavy, it's cheap, something to build yourself. Saplings are expendable. That should last you more than a few years for sure. Anything else? I think the only other thing I think I could point out is this rope is another consideration to think about. I've used all sorts of things from Singer sewing machine leather to what was it? Different cords. I've tried different cords, but this is I think it's starter cord for like chainsaws or something, and it's just this really rugged starter cord for pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling. So it really resists abrasion. And Peter Follansbee turned me on to that, and I guess the Bodger crew of people, they are into that. So it really just resists wearing. Otherwise, it just wears, and then it'll break. And obviously, if you want this rope way over here, because if you're turning and you nick it with your gouge, the whole thing's over because the rope goes flying and you got to get a new rope. So that's pretty much it. If you're looking for more information about that, you can check out our reprint of issue 3 in the first 3 issues. Or you can leave a comment below. I'm happy to talk about it. But this is my favorite style of lathe. It's kind of like Andre Roubaud's, and it's just this nice, solid, heavy fixture that you're able to do all sorts of turning. Weight, mass, and rigidity is what you're looking for. So I welcome your comments. I'm happy to interact with you, and thanks for watching.